Welcome back. We're going to be talking today about Matthew chapter 24, a highly disputed portion of Scripture with many people who have many different feelings and many strong opinions about what these verses, what this passage teaches, what this discourse of our Lord actually teaches. I'm going to ask you a favor, and that is I'm going to ask you to read Matthew chapter 24. And if you're real brave, you'll read Matthew chapter 23, 24, and 25 because they kind of fit together as a unit. However, at the very least, I would like you to read Matthew chapter 24. And the reason for that is I'm not going to be reading it all here just for sake of time as far as the video is concerned, but I'm going to be referencing it as though we had just read it or as though you had just read it. And so in order to be up to speed on kind of the references I'm going to be giving out of Matthew chapter 24, when I just mention a verse or a section of it, you're going to have to know what section of that is. And so the best way to do that is to pause the video and go ahead and read it. Now, with that in mind, I would like to jump into the text, and I'm going to talk about the two most popular views on Matthew chapter 24, their strengths and their weaknesses, and then I'm going to be giving a third alternative that I don't really find too popular, but it's popular among some people, among some scholars like D.A. Carson and like myself, if you want to consider me a scholar. And so I'm going to be giving that one probably in the next video. In this video, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be dealing with the two most popular views on the book of Revelation. I mean, on the Mount Olivet Discourse, so Matthew 24. I'm going to be talking about their strengths and their weaknesses and why I reject both schools of thought. Well, what are those two schools of thought? Well, the main school of thought is what's called dispensationalism, and there's all kinds of different dispensational thought when it comes to Matthew 24 as far as what exactly fits into a 7-year tribulation period and what is still part of the secret rapture of the church. So you're going to have to forgive me if I don't address every single type of dispensationalist out there. I'm going to be dealing with probably the most popular view of dispensationalism when it comes to Matthew chapter 24. Now, and then the other view, which, and even though I would say that, let me say this, the view of dispensationalism is waning. It's kind of losing its grip on our society. It used to be so strong and so pervasive that it was very difficult to believe anything but dispensationalism. But that is starting to diminish slightly in our culture, and I'm actually happy for it because I'm not a dispensationalist. You want to know where I stand? It's not with dispensationalism, so I'm happy about that. But there's another view that I would consider to be not as popular as the dispensationalist view, but I would almost consider it to be probably the second most popular, particularly among people who consider themselves to be Reformed, especially among Reformed Baptists and Presbyterians, and that is the preterist view. Preterist view I'm going to be using that as a partial preterist view. I'm not going to be really addressing full preterism at this point. So forgive me if I don't always say partial preterist. I mean partial preterist. And what I mean by that is someone who believes that a majority of the book of Matthew 24, a majority of that passage is fulfilled in 70 AD, but they still believe that there is a future return of Christ, a visible future return of Christ. But they would see large portions of Matthew 24 and large portions of the book of Revelation as being fulfilled in 70 AD, but they do believe in a future return of Christ, as opposed to full preterists who believe that it's all fulfilled. Everything has been fulfilled in AD 70. So when I use the term preterism, I'm talking about partial preterism. And even there are many different schools of thought as to how far you go to what's fulfilled. And I'm not going to be able to address every one. I'll be addressing the one I used to hold because I used to be a partial preterist, and I'll be addressing some of the most popular ones, like the one that Greg Bahnsen, where I learned it from Greg Bahnsen and Kenneth Gentry, and I think it's the same view held by Gary DeMar as far as the book of not the book, but the passage of Matthew 24. So let's get into this. If you understand Matthew 24, you understand the backdrop where Jesus was just denouncing the Pharisees and saying that all the blood from righteous Abel to Zacharias is going to come upon that current generation. And then he leaves the temple. And as he goes out of the temple, he said, as he's saying inside the temple, your house is left to you desolate. And so there's some allusion already to the destruction of Jerusalem in his words, in Christ's words. And so as he comes out of the temple, his disciples point back to it, and he tells them, he makes this prediction that there will not be one stone left upon another here that won't be thrown down. And then they travel to the Mount Olivet, which is about an hour and a half walk, as I recall. These people aren't riding buses or anything like that, so they're walking, they're on foot, and it's been a while. It's been since 1994 since I've been there, but when I was there and I took the trip, I walked there. I remember it being a pretty healthy hike, so 45 minutes to an hour and a half from the city of Jerusalem to the Mount Olivet. And when they get up there, his disciples ask him a series of questions. And you can break the questions down into two types of questions, but if you look at the whole synoptics, it's actually four questions, but two of them address the same thing and two of them address another thing. And we can kind of get the whole flavor of them just here from Matthew chapter 23. And in Matthew chapter 23, in verse 3, it says, as he sat on the Mount Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So now that's the question that they ask. Now, Jesus begins to answer their questions. Now, there's more than one question there. It's questions. Now, I'm going to give you the scheme of the dispensationalists, how the dispensationalist looks at this verse. They are asking, in some respect, about the future, because they believe in a future resurrection, and they believed in I don't think they had a clarity, don't misunderstand me, the disciples did not have a clarity that we have today. I'm not sure they understood that they obviously didn't understand Jesus was going to die and ascend, so they didn't really understand that he was going to return, but in some sense their question was about the future, and this is where the end of the age. This is where the futurists have got it right, at least in part. When it says the end of the age, we must not think of that as some type of dispensational system, as though these people were slicing history into 7 parts. They weren't. The end of the age to them meant the end of the world. They weren't sitting there thinking, what's the end? It's going to be the end of the Jewish age, and then we're going to have the church age, and then we're going to have millennium. No. The end of the age to them meant the end of the world as it existed then. And when did eternity begin? So, in one sense, their question is about the future, and this is where dispensationalists capitalize here. And what they do is they interpret verse 4 down to verse 28, where it talks about a time of tribulation and wars and rumors of wars and all these things. All the way down to there, they believe that this is a 7-year tribulation period that is still in the future after the rapture of the church. And then in verses 29 through 31, they believe that this is the return of Christ after that 7-year tribulation. That's how they're interpreting it. Verses 4 up to 28, the 7-year tribulation. Verses 29 through 31 is a return of Christ. And then they look at verse 32 is kind of an explanation, verses 32 through 35. But they would look at verse 36 all the way through the rest of the chapter as a different discourse, a different answer regarding the secret rapture of the church, according to dispensationalists. According to dispensationalists, they look at that as, see, on that day they're going to be given in marriage and eating and drinking and la da 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 and everything, and then one day one's going to be taken, another one's going to be left. Two will be standing in the field, one will be taken, another will be left. And you know the verses. So that's how they package this together. One portion's talking about the 7-year tribulation, and then immediately after that 7-year tribulation, the return of Christ, and then a digression from that to talk about the secret rapture of the church. Now, what are some strengths of this position? Well, number one, I would have to agree that one of the strengths of the position is that it's a tight package. I mean, they have their verses really sealed off and really packaged well if you presuppose dispensationalism. Here are these verses, and they're talking about this part, and here are these verses, and they're talking about this part, and here are these verses, and they're talking about this part, and it seems to be a very tight package. Another thing that I appreciate is the futureness of the dispensational view. It is just not right for people to think that this can all be jammed into 70 A.D., particularly because they ask, when is the end of the age? And the end of the age to them meant the end of the world. Again, they were not thinking, oh, the end of the age means the end of the Jewish age. Come on, put yourself in their position. These were Jews thinking Jesus was going to clear out and rebuild the temple and have the glory of Solomon. When they meant the end of the age, they meant the end of the world. They were talking, and they were probably confusing some of the ideas. So especially when Jesus starts talking about his return, it's really difficult to take that as anything but the return of Christ. The stars falling from heaven, when it says immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of the Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now, this just sounds on the surface like the return of Christ. It doesn't sound like something that happens in 70 A.D. Now, I know that my preterist brothers will object to this, and I will get to that momentarily. But you almost have to be trained to be a preterist to read these passages preteristically. If you just read it, it just seems a collection of those symbols talks about the end of the world, and I'll talk about why that is in just a moment. So please, if you're a preterist, you're sitting on the edge of the seat, well, I know what each one of those means, and I can explain each one of those verses and given its Old Testament context. And I understand where you're coming from. I used to come from the same place, so just relax. I'll get to that. But one of the things that I'm saying I appreciate is that they still look at this as a future event, which I do too. So I appreciate that, and I, for one, count it as a strength. I don't count it as a weakness. So those are the strengths, but what are the weaknesses? Well, there are a few massive weaknesses of this system, and this is why I'm not a dispensationalist. One of the weaknesses is they don't take the time text seriously. When Jesus says, this generation will not pass until all these things take place, they play games with that. Now, I understand that they don't think they're playing games, but quite honestly, they've dealt with it in two ways. They've said either that the term generation means this race of Jews will not pass until these things happen, or they say that it's the generation in which these things occur. So when these things happen, when the rapture of the church happens, then that generation is not going to take place that generation is not going to die out until the Lord returns. But quite honestly, this is just playing word games. If you look at that word in the Greek and you look at other places that it's used in Matthew, particularly by Jesus, but the overall Matthean context, it means that generation of people. When Jesus said that this generation is has seen somebody who has more wisdom than Solomon, he was talking to that current group of people. He wasn't talking about a future group. He wasn't talking about anything else. He was talking about that current group of people. So they don't take the time text seriously, and there's a little wiggle room when it comes to that time text. They don't really want to bite into that because it really does destroy their system. So that's one weakness that it has. A second weakness that it has is that it cannot be read. It has to be read almost in isolation. It can't be read with the other parallel passages very well, because in Luke chapter 21, particularly when it says Jerusalem was surrounded by armies, that is almost indisputably happening with Titus in AD 70. So it's almost like you have to read this and you can't read it with its parallel passages, and you get some ridiculous claims. Even people like I've heard Chuck Smith and Chuck Missler say things like, well, they're not even talking about the same thing. And I'm like, look, any reading of Matthew chapter 24 and Luke chapter 21, you're going to understand that these are parallel passages, and what Luke is doing is putting them into Gentile context. So when Luke says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, he is talking about Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, and he is giving a parallel to Matthew talking about the destruction, the abomination of desolation. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you know its desolation is near. Also, much of the language in chapter 24 is first century Jerusalem language. When don't go down into your house, flee from one housetop to another. These are things that they would have been familiar with, because that's how houses were constructed. In other words, it's not taking very seriously the time text, and it can't be read in light of other the parallel account in Luke chapter 21. Pardon me. All right, and then there's one more weakness I want to get into. The other weakness is that it doesn't take at least part of the questions seriously that the disciples ask. Because one of the questions they ask is about the destruction of the temple. He comes out of the temple, he points to it, and Jesus points to it and says, not one stone here will be left upon another. And they come and ask him, when will these things take place? Now, I have to grant, and I think we have to take into account, that the disciples were confused about the end of the world and the destruction of Jerusalem and all that stuff, and they didn't have a clarity in which we can look back and have more clarity now. We can't force that kind of clarity into their mind, but part of the question they were asking was about the destruction of the temple, which Jesus prophesied. And you would have to believe that Jesus doesn't answer this question at all, that he just skips that question entirely. And I find that really hard to get by, that Jesus would just look at that and just skip it entirely. Why would he just skip that verse entirely? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. So there's your strengths and there's your weaknesses, and overall I think the weaknesses outweigh the strengths of the system, and therefore I am not a dispensationalist. They cannot deal with the straight language of this generation. They cannot deal with the fact that the parallel passages clearly are a reference to AD 70, and they cannot deal they cannot deal with the fact that part of the question was about AD 70, that the disciples would have been asking about the destruction of Jerusalem. So let's get into the preterist view and talk about its strengths and its weaknesses. So the preterists see, Jesus is coming out of the temple, making this prediction. They take the hike to the Mount of Olives, and then they ask him this series of questions. When will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And they look at chapter 24, verses 4, all the way to verse 28 as time leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem. wars and rumors of wars, and they are very good at pointing out all the bad things that happened during that particular time period, and reading Josephus. So they look at all that stuff and they look at it and they say, see, all this stuff was happening in their day. Earthquakes, famines, all that stuff was happening in their day. And then they look at verses 29 through 31 as the destruction of Jerusalem. That's kind of the big culminating passage. All these things happen, and then this happens, and that is the destruction of Jerusalem. And they look at, actually, it's difficult because there are so many preterists, and they'll have these little kind of different spins. Some of them will look at it that way, but some of them will look at the whole thing, verse 4 all the way up through verse 31, as the destruction of Jerusalem. Some isolate the other part out and say this is the destruction of Jerusalem. The rest is just everything leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem. And then verse 34 through 35 is the explanation about this generation, and they say, see, this generation's not going to pass away until they see all these things take place. Well, what do they do with verse 36 through the rest of the chapter? Verse 36 through the rest of the chapter depends on what kind of preterist you're talking to. Full preterists see it all as 70 AD, and even some partial preterists will view this, push this back into 70 AD. However, most partial preterists look at this as future event still, as the return of Christ. So what they do is they take the disciples' question seriously, and they say, well, Jesus is talking about the end of the age, the end of the world, and they ask about the end of the world, and so Jesus talks about the end of the world, but they're also talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, and so they take that seriously too. And so they say this portion up to verse 35 is talking about the destruction of AD 70, answering one of their questions, one of the disciples' questions. And then verse 36 is talking about the end of the world, talking about another portion of their questions, and it's like untangling the convoluted questions that the disciples are asking. And I know you've experienced this, where somebody asks you a question and really it's kind of a tangled web of questions. You kind of untangle it and you say, well, this question's actually answered this way and this question's actually answered this way. And so that's what the disciples are doing, and Jesus is untangling that, looking at one half of it, the destruction of Jerusalem, that's one of your questions, and the other half of it, the end of the world. Where he says, well, no one knows of that day or hour, but not even the Son of Man or the angels, only the Father in heaven, but there'll be two left in a field, and all that stuff. Well, what are some strengths? Well, one strength is that it takes the time text seriously. It says this generation, and that time text is consistent with Matthew's overall context and with Jesus' immediate context. Because you got to remember, Jesus just told these Pharisees that all the blood of righteous Abel to Zechariah is going to come upon that generation. So it takes the time text very seriously. And I appreciate that about the preterist position, or the partial preterist position. The other thing that it takes is it takes the question seriously of the disciples. That's another strength that it has, is that it takes as I explained already, it really tries to look at the disciples' questions and untangle them and really answer and pinpoint those things. So it takes the time text seriously, and it takes the end of the world seriously and the return of Christ seriously. So I appreciate that about my preteristic brothers, the Orthodox preteristic brothers. But what are some of the weaknesses of this? Well, I'd have to say that one of the weaknesses is that it seems on a cursory reading that verses 29 through 31 is talking about the return of Christ. And you almost have to be trained not to think that in order to think it, in order to not think it. When it gives all these cataclysmic signs and the return of Christ and the return of the Son and the Son of Man, the sign of the Son of Man appearing in heaven, it almost seems like it's an indisputable return of Christ and that there is some type of future fulfillment to it. Now, how do they overcome that? Well, they overcome that by isolating each verse out of this section and showing that there are places in the Old Testament where these things are to be taken non-literally. So they say, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven. And they look at passages such as Isaiah chapter 13, where these kind of same things are described to talk about the invasion of the Medo-Persians into Babylon. So they say, see, that's not literal, so therefore this can't be literal. And yes, and they go through each one of those and say, well, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. See, it's just the sign, it's not the Son of Man. It's just his sign that will appear in heaven. And angels don't necessarily have to mean angels. They can be messengers going out to four corners of the earth. This could be the spread of the gospel, to gather the elect in and all this stuff. And we got to take the time text seriously. However, as D.A. Carson put it, the cacophony of these events put together, these symbols put together, just seems to be talking about the return of Christ. And everywhere else in the New Testament, when these symbols are used, it's talking about the return of Christ. Let me give you an example. You can look these up on your own. In Matthew chapter 13, in verse 36, it's talked about the wheat and the tares are explained. The parable of the wheat and the tares are explained. And some of these same images are used where he comes back with his angels. And it's about the end of the world and the gathering together of the tares and the wheat. Same image used, not applied to 70 AD, but applied to the end of the world. In Matthew chapter 16 and verse 27 is another reference to Christ coming back and judging with angels. In Matthew chapter 25, it talks about when Jesus comes back, the Son of Man returns, and all his holy angels with him, and then he will divide the sheep among the goats, as a shepherd divides the sheep among the goats. And he'll put the sheep on his right hand, the goats on his left hand, and you know the parable, obviously into the world, but same imagery involved. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 13, with the shout of the trumpet and the dead in Christ raised. Another image used not to talk about 70 AD, but to talk about the end of the world. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 verse 7 and 2 Peter chapter 3 verses 10 through 12 all use this same image to talk about the return of Christ and not about 70 AD. It's really hard to make it about 70 AD and not about the return of Christ. As a matter of fact, I think impossible. So in the New Testament, when all these things are used to talk about the end of to talk about the return of Christ, it just seems odd that this wouldn't also be, especially the compilation of it. The compilation really seems to say, hey, this is about AD 70. This isn't about AD 70. You can't jam it all in there. This is about the return of the Lord. That's one problem that I find with it. The second problem is you have to read it in isolation as well. One of the things you have to do is they make a big deal is they say, well, it's not the Son of Man that returns, it's the sign of the Son of Man. The problem is Luke chapter 21 and Mark chapter 13 both don't say the sign of the Son of Man, they say the Son of Man. The Son of Man will return. So, like the dispensationalist who can't read it together, neither can the preterist. It says the Son of Man will return in the clouds, not just the sign of the Son of Man. Now, of course, if the Son of Man returns, that's going to be the sign of the Son of Man as well. So there's no contradiction there. But in order to isolate that out, you have to do exactly what the dispensationalists do, and you have to ignore the other text. Now, here's the other problem. And another problem with not being able to read it harmoniously with the other Gospels comes in Luke chapter 21. And if you have your Bible, I would really like you to open it to see the parallel account of Luke chapter 21 and verse 25. It says, "And there will be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, and on earth distress of nations and perplexity because of the roaring of the sea and the waves, people fainting with fear and with forbidding of what is to come on the world. For the powers of the heavens will be shaken, and then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power of great glory. Now when these things begin to take place, straighten up and raise your head. Your redemption draws near. How is the destruction of Jerusalem our redemption? Now, if it said our vindication, I could kind of go with a partial preterist view, because you could say, well, it's our vindication. Here it is. God is vindicating us, destroying the Jews and destroying, the Jewish system, and showing that He's put an end to that sacrificial system, and that's our vindication as Christians. But it doesn't say that. It says our redemption draws near. How is the destruction of Jerusalem our redemption? It isn't. The problem is this is talking about a future event of the return of Christ. Our redemption draws near when Christ returns. That's going to be our ultimate redemption when we are fully glorified, soul and body. So that's the problem that I have with the partial preterist view. It doesn't take the rest of the New Testament when it uses these apocalyptic language, because the rest of the New Testament, when it uses the apocalyptic language, is always talking about the return of Christ. And it should say, there are many places where it does talk about the return of Christ, and you have to read it in isolation. Well, then what is the alternative? If the preterist, partial preterist isn't right, and if the dispensationalist isn't right, who's got the right answer? And we don't want to go into the heresy of full preterism. That's off the table. Well, what's the answer? Well, you'll have to join me next time. Please, I hope you enjoyed this. Please like, share, and join me next time as we talk about the true meaning of Matthew chapter 24.